Hey, welcome back. Um, we are going to continue on where we left off yesterday, um, dealing with the question of the legacies of historical globalization and looking at the same question, how effectively have governments responded to the legacies of historical globalization? For those of you that are following along in the workbook, this is page 15. Um, Yesterday's video, well, I guess part two of yesterday's video, it talked about the project that I asked you to start. Um, have a look at part two. It runs through everything quite well. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask. But I didn't give you a due date for that. Let's just try to get it done as soon as possible. Um, don't worry about due dates for now. We'll try to figure these things out. But let's focus on today's lecture. We're going to look at how governments around the world have responded to the legacies of historical globalization, primarily colonialism and imperialism. We're going to focus a little bit of a case study looking at South Africa because there's a lot of history, especially in Africa in general, but South Africa has a very good has a good insight as to the responses to um, historical globalization. So, some terms that you may want to review that might help you is the Industrial Revolution. So we talked about that a few. I think we are still in class when we talked about that. And mercantilism. For those of you that were in class the day we played the game, that is mercantilism. So keep those terms in mind, and if you're not sure what they mean, review them and then watch the rest of this video. It may help you to give a good understanding. But let's begin. We're going to focus on, again, how effectively have people responded to the legacies of historical globalization. So, like I said yesterday, many countries around the world had colonial rulers. If you were living in a country outside of Europe, there's a very, very high chance that you, at one point in time, your country had been colonized by the Europeans. It may not be that way anymore in this time that we're thinking, but all places did. So yesterday we looked at Rwanda. It had two, first the Germans and then the Belgians, and then we also the day before we looked at Canada. So Canada also was colonized by the French and the British. The British ultimately kicked the French out, and we settled with the one colonial ruler. So fast forward when we get the creation of the United Nations, um, all countries in the world are part of the United Nations, even today. And a lot of the countries that are part of the United Nations, they have indigenous people living within those borders. So the United Nations has a mandate. So they have a kind of like a mission, and it includes international peace and security. So one of the main jobs of the United Nations is to, try to stop wars or try to end conflicts that exist. The United Nations did go into Rwanda. We talked about it yesterday, but they were very much not the most effective force. A good example of effectiveness of the United Nations would be Cyprus. So, for those of you who aren't aware, Cyprus has two ethnic groups living within it: Greek Cyprians and Turkish Cyprians. And they don't really like each other, so there's a lot of conflict. So, the United Nations has set up a presence there for a very long time, actually. And Canada's played a really big role in that to maintain peace. So they have peacekeepers there that have just been protecting civilians. Because other things that the United Nations promotes is human rights, the protection of the environment, fighting poverty and disease, and to help refugees. So they send people and they send aid to countries in need to make sure that these sort of things are protected. And this does include indigenous people as well. because, like I said, all countries are members of the United Nations, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the voices of people are represented in the United Nations. So many groups of people are not represented at the United Nations. Some have been given special status. For example, the Palestinians. There is no country called Palestine anymore, but there is a people called the Palestinians. They occupy Gaza and the West Bank now. They have been given special status to observe the United Nations. So they're a member, but not a full member. So that's an example of a group that is represented. But there are no representatives from, say, the Maori people of New Zealand, or the Blackfoot, the Cree, Ojibwe of North America, the Inuit of, say, places like Norway and Finland. So there are a lot of people that are not represented. 370 million indigenous groups are not represented. So that is quite a lot. There are no tribes from the Amazon that are represented that would probably have a voice in, say, things like looking for resources in the Amazon and cutting down trees. So work is being done to bring awareness to these issues because these voices are not represented. So we have to figure out how it is we're going to do that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to focus our attention on South Africa because South Africa had voices that were not heard, and they were the majority, actually. So we're going to focus our attention on a little bit of the history of South Africa, and then we'll return back to the more global response to historical globalization and its legacies, things like colonialism and imperialism. So there's where you'd insert mercantilism, because colonialism and imperialism are set up so that mercantilism works better. The whole mother country colony relationship. So the Dutch were the first to colonize South Africa. They did it in 1652, so that's way before the British were there. It was a colony as well. The British will arrive there, the French and the Portuguese. The Portuguese, we saw the map of Africa in our booklet. They had occupied certain coastal areas of Africa. They weren't in it for the deep penetration. They wanted the small trading posts. But more and more Europeans will arrive, and Europeans start to dominate indigenous groups all over Africa, but especially in South Africa. Remember the slave trade. For those of you that, all of you will do it eventually, but those of you who recall, in the slavery assignment, we saw those thick arrows leaving Africa. They were thickest in West and Southwest Africa. So, but some slaves did also come from South Africa as well. Fast forward 300 years or so, in 1926, South Africa became an independent dominion in the British Empire. So it kind of had the same status that Canada had. The way that the British got it is through the Boer War. So they fought the Boer, which were a people of South African Dutch mix, also called Afrikaners. They fought wars against them. First, the British lost, then the British returned, and then were able to defeat the Dutch settlers, the Boer, and then established the colony for themselves. 1926 is when it gets that special status, essentially like Canada, where it has its own leadership, but it's still under the umbrella of the British Empire. So, demographically speaking, people there, blacks outnumbered whites 10-1. So the overwhelming majority population in South Africa were blacks. So there were laws passed to secure white political and economic power. So same thing, kind of like what we talked about with Rwanda. There's two groups that are vying for power. Same thing like in Rwanda, the minority takes the political power. So the whites, they secure themselves power and then positions of authority over the majority black Africans living there. So, again, we're going to fast forward a few years here. 1945, the end of the Second World War. there's a call for independence. So after World War II, we see a lot of former colonies seeking independence. Um, India is another example. We spoke about India in 1947. 2 years later, they get independence. So South Africa is also calling for independence. So the government in South Africa began a policy of apartheid, essentially laws that segregated the population. So what we see is a system developed where all ethnic groups living in South Africa are going to be classified and separated. Again, very similar to what we saw in Rwanda with the classification cards being created. Who's a Hutu and who's a Tutsi. So that is set up again in South Africa, focused very much so on race and ethnicity. So there is protests that were started by people in South Africa advocating for an end to this regime of segregation by the parts of the government there. One of the most outspoken voices is Nelson Mandela. You may know him from the school nearby. He was an advocate for the African National Congress. He was protesting this separation of races in South Africa. He actually will be put in jail, and he will stay in jail for 27 years because he advocated strongly for an end to this apartheid regime. So in 1976, June the 16th, we see a escalation of this conflict. So there is a demonstration by black students for equality in education. The police, they're not really interested in listening. They resort to violence, and 168 are killed. Could be more, could be less, we're not too sure. But after this moment, the international community sees this and it starts to rub them the wrong way. So international community is outraged and often viewed as the beginning of the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa. So 10 years later or so, the system begins to be dismantled. It gets taken away. And then the first election for the whole country is held in 1994. And one of the people running is the newly released Nelson Mandela. He runs and wins the election. So Nelson Mandela becomes the first black president of South Africa. And he begins not a campaign of revenge, but a campaign of truth and reconciliation to establish healing of the wounds of the past. So what we see here is if we're looking at the question of how effectively have people responded to the legacies of historical globalization, South Africa started a path towards ethnic segregation and out-and-out racism by the apartheid regime against the overwhelming black majority population. But the response by the international community and the people was to dismantle this system and then bring about a new way of changing things. We're introduced to Nelson Mandela, who again doesn't resort to violence, but switches the emphasis on healing and reconciliation between the groups to bring about a peaceful future. So we see the legacies causing a rift between blacks and whites, but the response is not to continue this conflict, but to bring people together to form a good unity in South Africa. So that's one of the areas of focus. Now let's jump back over the Atlantic and focus on Canada. We're going to go back in time too, about 100 years, to the um, First World War. So Canada joins the First World War because the British declared war on the Germans. Um, so Canada is involved in the First World War. Um, in Canada, being a population of immigrants, um, they are untrusting of German and Ukrainian, Austrian, Italian, and Bulgarian um, Canadians. They feel that their sympathies are not with their current country, but with their mother country. So they intern them. They bring them to camps. They are labeled as enemy aliens, and 8,500 are interned and forced to live in camps. Um, no official apology has ever been issued. So what they would do is they were used essentially as a form of slave labor. So for those of you that have ever been to Banff National Park, um, it's a very lovely place. There are many different walking trails and paths that are set up throughout the mountains there. Um, the interned enemy aliens, and I use that term in quotations, they actually built those pathways. So the pathways in Banff were built by enemy aliens during the First World War. There was a plaque. I forget where it is though in Banff, but it did address this, and it did bring this to light again. But no official apology has ever been issued. So we do see this as a legacy as well. Focusing again on Canada, we did the exact same thing, internment of the Japanese Canadians. Fast forward though to the Second World War. So after Pearl Harbor in 1942, many Japanese Canadians were accused of spying for the Japanese Empire. So 10,000 were forced to live in internment camps. Away from the coast. So those who lived in British Columbia were brought to places like Alberta and Saskatchewan, where they set up camps for them to live in. Their property was confiscated. It was taken away, and it was sold actually to other Canadians at a lower rate. So we do see that happening in places like Nazi Germany as well. So Jews who were taken out of German cities were actually had their stuff taken from them. So I'm not trying to say that Canada is the equal of Nazi Germany, but I just want you to be aware that evil things have taken place as well in this country. So in 1988, there was a settlement reached for those who survived. Each survivor of the internment was given $21,000 and an official apology. So I mean, that in and of itself, I don't know. It doesn't really. You can't put a price, in my opinion, at least. This is my opinion. It's really hard to put a price on taking someone's life away and forcing them to live in a essentially a concentration camp, and then 40 years later apologize. Here's some money. I don't know. Maybe some of you think otherwise, but I feel that this is one response to historical globalization, and it kind of resembles the apology made by the then Prime Minister Stephen Harper for residential schools. I don't think that sort of apology is really going to heal a lot of these deeper wounds. But again, we'll have to just see what happens. If you're following along slide 15 here, I believe this is a map of the different. I can't really read it. Different camps during the Japanese internment. Now let's shift our attention again the legacies of the Indian Act. So I introduced this a few days ago. It came out in 1876, and it has been accused by many for the not equal treatment of First Nations people. Um, what it essentially did, again, and this may just be going over it again, is it really controlled the lives of the Indigenous people of Canada. It even decided who was and who was not based on your family heritage and based on blood. It's still in place. Change is recognized but not being implemented. So we understand that what it's doing is wrong, but no steps are being taken to change this. There were some attempts. So the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples was established in 1991 and attempted to change or address the fairness of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. Has called the Canadian government's past policy as wrong. It has made aware how the Canadian government has been acting is not a way that is going to make things better. It has shown to be a failure. And one of the ways that it has done so is it has not addressed this idea of fairness, of equality within Canada. So again, fast forward. So we're going to talk here about the changing the Indian Act, the first national governance bill in 2002. So attempts to eliminate the harmful effects of the Indian Act and allow self-government. It was criticized as not having First Nations input in its creation. So we do see attempts later on to try to change things, but it's not where both sides have been brought to the table to try to change things. It's more a one-sided thing. This picture here, for those of you following along on slide 19, this is from the Oka crisis, which I believe I may have shown you in class. I will put some videos in the description for the Oka crisis, as well as maybe some things about Japanese internment and things about Nelson Mandela, if I can find some nice videos to show you to help you understand things. But this is an iconic photo, and it just goes to show you the sort of relationship that exists in Canada. It is one of mistrust and one of steps away from escalated violence. We talked about the relationship that has existed in Canada between the Indigenous people and the Europeans. We've been talking about it for the last few days. And I remember mentioning that when these two peoples came together, there was a lot of mistrust and there was a lot of violence from the beginning. One of the people that I had brought up back when we were talking about the first European encounters was the Beothuk. So these were the Indigenous people of modern-day Newfoundland. They attempted to avoid Europeans and moved away from settlements. So they really didn't want to have anything to do with the Europeans. However, when they were denied their traditional food sources, the fish and seals, and led to the overhunting of the caribou, they had really no choice but to interact. And for a lot of cases, it was a negative interaction, so much so that they were officially declared extinct in 1829. So, if we were to talk about, say, the legacy of historical globalization and how people will respond to it, there is a lot of questions about how do you respond to a people being extinct, wiped out because of the relationship between the Europeans and Indigenous people. My question, if we're looking back to how they treated the Japanese and giving them compensation, how does one compensate for wiping out an entire race of people? I don't know. That's a that's a tough question. But these are legacies that we must address. And because all of the Beothuk are no longer existing, we have to kind of speak up for them on their behalf. Um, so these are things that we need to be aware of and have to address when we deal with the legacies of historical globalization. Um, so, how effectively have organizations responded to the legacy of historical globalization? Well, many international organizations exist to assist other people. So, where government is not necessarily doing the best job, groups organize themselves that will advocate for people. There are advocate groups for peoples who have no voice in, say, the United Nations. There are advocate groups who will advocate for the climate in many different ways, but they will still try their best to make people aware. They often regard organizational goals above those of the people being helped. So they do try to press many different issues to different peoples at different times. We give a special name to these sorts of organizations that don't have a government connection. These are called NGOs, or non-governmental organizations. So they are not associated with a particular government. They are created by people to try and promote some sort of aid to a cause or a people, or anything, diseases, these sort of things. So if you're following along on slide 24, we have some here. These are 4 examples. So these vary widely in nature on areas and abilities to provide assistance. So some of them are really organized. They have a reason, like they have a base of income that they can work with. Some it's a little different. So we have Avega Agozo. So this is an organization from Rwanda that helps widows and children. So that's a very specific to Rwanda. Some of the other ones here, actually, the rest are all international. So we have Greenpeace International. So Greenpeace focuses on the environmental issues. Then we have Human Rights Watch. So this advocates for human rights around the world. So they will go around and they'll make sure and monitor that certain governments are acting according to human rights laws that have been passed by the United Nations. Remember, every country is a member of the United Nations, so every country has signed on to follow their rules. So these non-government organizations will make sure that, okay, you signed this, but what are you doing? Are you following along? So they will check these sort of things. Amnesty International is probably one of the most well-known. And then Doctors Without Borders. Again, this is essentially doctors and nurses who've organized themselves, and they will travel to places where there is either disease outbreak, where there is war, anything where their services can be used. It's a free service, and it provides medical aid to those in need. So places like in the Congo recently, where we had the outbreak of Ebola, there were Doctors Without Borders, and they were there providing aid to people who needed it. They go to places where there are civil wars, and where there are places where people are suffering, refugee camps. They set up sort of things there. The Syrian civil war. A lot of Syrian refugees are still living in Turkey and in these refugee camps, and Doctors Without Borders will go there just to make sure that everyone is being taken care of medically as well. So these, again, non-governmental organizations are responding to the legacies of historical globalization in this way, where they are trying to aid people who are being overlooked. So they do have the ability to influence government policies and decisions. For example, those that deal with human rights sometimes are they are outspoken, and they will go to the media to challenge certain governments. So they are sometimes criticized as undermining governmental authority or even attempting to remove governments. So international NGOs, they curtail local response to need. So a new form of imperialism, focus too narrow. Many feel NGOs focus on one area to exclude all other all of other all others. So these are some critiques of NGOs. Some people say this is a new form of imperialism because you have an outside group coming in and kind of taking over certain things that the government may have a certain plan for. Um, Others kind of say, "Hey, your focus is too narrow. What about other people?" So these are some critiques against non-government organizations. So again, anything we talk about will always have two sides. So in this case, there is that sort of conflict between NGOs, good or bad. Um, so let's focus on this new question here. How does historical globalization continue to affect the world? Dramatic change has occurred in the world in the last 20 years. I mean, we're kind of living in something that has not happened in 100 years or so. We are living in a new time where the new normal is, well, you can kind of see it. We don't go to school anymore. I have to sit here and talk to you via the internet. So the world is changing, and the effects of globalization are still felt. Um, Racism and ethnocentrism, Eurocentrism, these sort of things, they still are present. An example of this, a modern example, is from as recent as these last 2 weeks. This is a specific example. The President of the United States has called this virus a Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, as it was called. Um, what this is doing is discrimination. Any sort of discrimination that exists is an effect of globalization. It is a negative effect. Yeah, there are some positives. I mean, we're living one right now. The fact that you can see me and hear me is a positive example of globalization. But the negatives exist as well. Um, we see this when we look at how certain countries have been responding to things like poverty. So in some countries, the income gap is huge, and it's also huge between countries. So there is a huge difference between the developed and the developing nations, and this is a concern because it's not like it's going like this; it's more going like this. And the reason that we have this sort of relationship where there are some countries that are they are well off and others that are still below that well off stage is because of imperialism. Some of the poorest countries in the world, if you look at their history, they were colonies. Yes, some of the richest were colonies too, but the majority of them were not. Some of them are moving towards that status of being a lot better off in terms of the economy, but not really. A lot of the poorest countries were colonies at one time, and we will address that in the next unit when we talk about economic globalization. But the income gap between developed and undeveloped or developing is growing. And then we have to bring up this idea of foreign aid. So there is set up through the United Nations and other countries have set up this foreign aid. So money, supplies, expertise, and other goods are given from one country to another. It can be things like medicine. It can be things like food. It can be things like sending people over to help develop industries. These sort of things are created to help the developing countries. And it ties to the gross national income by the United Nations. So the United Nations is monitoring these sort of things as well, which is important. They need to be addressing these sort of things as we go along, because, like I said, the effects of of this developed versus undeveloped or developing is it's widening. So 0.07% of the gross national income is the standard. Few countries contribute this. Canada has only been above 0.05% once. So the developing countries have not been doing a very good job of trying to help. Some will argue, though, that sending, food and medicine and things like that, it can create this system of complacency. They want they'll always be needing these things. We should be sending them things that will help them to create their own industry so that they can have better access to things instead of having to be dependent on us. But that underlies the fact that we are in the position that we are because of them. So European countries are wealthy because their colonies are not. So again, if you're following along, and this is in your booklet, page 30, this is essentially how it looks. The world. It's very distorted. It's become a very distorted sort of view. And I remember talking about this in class, and this is where I'll leave this off for today because there was a lot to digest today, and I know it jumped around a lot. So feel free to pause this and go back and listen, and I'll provide you with other videos too to maybe help give some more context. But in class, we talked about the royal family of Great Britain, and I know there's many other royal families, but we're focusing on the British. Whenever you see them go to their parties, they're wearing these fancy jewelry and all that stuff. Just remember where these jewels came from. And the more important question is, did they pay for them? They did not. So when we look at this question of foreign aid, we need to remember, and we need to look at it from the position of how did we get this far? How and why are these countries developed, and the effects of it on others. On coins in Britain, there's an inscription saying that we stand on the shoulders of giants, and they're saying that countries they're built off the success of greatness. I think we need to remember that a lot of countries around the world live the way they do off the backs of those who still live poorly. Let's not forget that as well. So that's it for today. I know this is the end of the booklet, so just work through this booklet, work through your projects. Tomorrow, I'll be here as well, and I will give you further instruction on what we do next. Okay, so stay safe, and I will see you tomorrow. But not really see you tomorrow. You'll see me tomorrow, but I'll just hope that you're all there.